My name is Vanessa Mercer, and I'm 34 years old. Last month, I stood in the back corner of a mahogany-paneled law office and listened as my father's final will and testament was read aloud. I wasn't mentioned. Not once. Not my name, not even a vague to my daughter. It was as though I had never existed. The house, the lake property, the antique collection, even the insurance payout, every last cent went to my brother and his wife. And yet, somehow, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, feeling nothing and everything all at once. If you've ever had the kind of betrayal that doesn't just sting, it rewrites your entire history, then you know what that moment feels like. And if not, let me tell you, it doesn't break you the way you'd expect. It burns something out of you. If you're watching this and you've ever had to claw your way back from the kind of family that forgets your name when the money is on the line, go ahead and comment below. I want to know how you survived it, because this is how I did. But before I can tell you how I built something they could never take away from me, I need to explain how I got here in the first place. It didn't start with the will. Not even close. My father, Walter Mercer, was a retired Air Force officer turned real estate mogul who built his empire in Phoenix, Arizona, flipping desert land into high-end condos. He believed in rules, structure, and the kind of tough love that left bruises in places no one could see. My mother, Cecily, was softer in manner but just as sharp where it counted, a quiet enabler wrapped in silk blouses and polite smiles. My older brother, Grant, was the chosen one, practically from birth. Blonde, tall, athletic, and preternaturally charming, he was the kind of boy who could crash a car, lie about it, and still get handed the keys to something newer the next week. I, on the other hand, was the child they didn't know what to do with, bookish, anxious, too quick to cry, too slow to speak. The truth is, they saw me as inconvenient from the beginning. I remember being 8 years old and watching from the kitchen doorway as my father taught Grant how to gut a fish out by the lake. The two of them stood barefoot on the dock, their shadows tall and golden in the evening light. I'd asked if I could join, timidly, already sensing the answer, and my father had barely turned his head to say, "This is a father-son thing, Ness. Go help your mother." It was always like that. Go help your mother meant go disappear. So I did. I disappeared into books, into sketch pads, into the attic where I'd sit under the eaves for hours inventing stories about other girls who lived in better houses with better fathers. No one noticed. No one asked what I was doing unless it interfered with dinner. I learned early that approval was something you earned through performance, not presence. Grant could do no wrong because he looked like our father, acted like him, and most importantly, believed the world owed him something. I didn't believe that. I just wanted to be seen. In high school, the gap widened. Grant drove a new Mustang his senior year, while I worked 2 part-time jobs to afford college applications and art supplies. I remember coming home late from a shift at the craft store one night, my uniform still dusty with glitter and sweat, and overhearing my father on the phone with someone, maybe a colleague or an old friend, saying, "Vanessa? She's not going to be much. She's sweet, but she doesn't have what it takes to carry this family forward. Grant's the one with vision." I stood frozen in the hallway, back pressed against the wall, my stomach curdling like sour milk. That one sentence followed me for years. It echoed in every job interview, every gallery rejection, every relationship that ended with "you're too intense" or "you care too much." But I kept going, because if I couldn't earn their love, maybe I could outgrow the need for it. By the time I was 28, I'd moved to Seattle and opened my own graphic design studio, small but sustainable. I had a studio apartment, a cat named Pliny, and an assistant who doubled as my only friend for a while. I called home out of obligation, birthdays and holidays mostly, but the conversations were stiff and short. Grant, meanwhile, had joined our father's company and was being groomed for succession. They sent me newsletters from the firm, all boasting Mercer and Son, shaping Arizona's skyline. Never a mention of the daughter. The company's social media posted family photos that didn't include me. Even when our mother died unexpectedly of an aneurysm, I wasn't consulted about the funeral plans. I was given a seat in the second row, behind Grant's wife's family. I sat there in a black dress I'd overnight from Nordstrom, listening to my brother give the eulogy. He never said my name once. The obituary listed Cecily as the beloved mother of Grant Mercer. That was it. As if I'd never existed. I suppose part of me hoped things would change when Dad's health began to decline. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's when I was 31. I flew down, visited, brought him books and his favorite dark chocolate from that overpriced boutique near my office. For a few brief moments, I thought we were bridging a gap that he was softening with age. He even called me kiddo once, the way he used to when I was small and sick with strep throat, and he'd sit at the end of my bed reading the sports section aloud, pretending to care. But the illusion cracked quickly. One night, I overheard him asking Gran if I'd come around, because she smells money on the horizon. My jaw clenched so tight, I felt my molars ache. I walked out without saying goodbye, and didn't come back until the hospital called 3 months later, asking if I wanted to be there when they removed life support. I wasn't sure what shocked me more, that they'd called me at all, or that a part of me actually considered it. I sat in that sterile ICU room, staring at the man who had once told me to stop embarrassing myself with all the crying, and tried to summon something: grief, rage, forgiveness. But all I felt was exhaustion. He looked small in that bed, deflated, like a balloon someone had let go of. When the nurse asked if I wanted to say a few words, I whispered, "I hope wherever you're going, they know how hard I tried." She thought I was being poetic. I was just being honest. A week later, the will was read. I came out of duty, not expectation. My brother and his wife arrived in designer black and took the front seats. I sat alone near the back, watching the lawyer's face carefully. When he cleared his throat and announced that the entirety of the Mercer estate was to be transferred to Grant and Elaine Mercer for their loyal and continued service to the family legacy, I didn't flinch. I just blinked slowly and waited for the moment to pass. It did, like everything else. What they didn't know, what they still don't, is that I kept something they couldn't measure in dollars or square footage. Something I had built piece by piece, year after year, through pain and rejection and sheer defiance. Integrity. And soon, that integrity was going to become a legacy. But not the kind they'd recognize. Not something you could bury in a vault or laminate in a boardroom. No, mine would be built in the open, visible to the world. And no one could erase me from it. Not this time. To understand how I became the woman they couldn't write out of existence, you have to go back, not just to childhood, but to the precise moment I decided that being excluded wasn't the same as being defeated. It happened during my final year of college. I was 22, living in a drafty shared house in Bellingham with 3 roommates who rotated between engineering lectures, ramen noodle dinners, and indie film screenings. I was putting myself through school with a patchwork of scholarships, grants, and every freelance design job I could land. I designed wedding invitations, yoga studio logos, pet portraits, anything people would pay me for. My art wasn't precious. It was practical. Survival disguised as creativity. There was one professor who changed everything, Dr. Louise Harcourt. She was sharp-tongued, never minced words, and didn't care where you came from as long as you showed up to work hard. She was the first person who looked me in the eye and said, "You don't owe anyone smallness." I think about that line constantly. Back then, I was still trying to please my family in the quietest ways. Sending birthday cards with long, handwritten notes. Making holiday phone calls that felt like pulling teeth. Mailing prints of my artwork home that I never once saw hung. I'd spent years hoping for some acknowledgement, a text from my father saying, "Proud of you, kiddo," or even a "good work" from Grant. It never came. But the turning point wasn't loud. It wasn't even tragic. It was an ordinary evening in April when I received an email from my father with one line. "Do you really think that's a career?" He'd attached a link to a design project I'd posted publicly, a brand identity I'd created for a climate justice nonprofit. I'd poured weeks of research and effort into it, and I'd been proud of how it came out. But he reduced it to a rhetorical slap. That was the night something inside me shifted. Not snapped, not broke, just shifted. I stared at his message for 5 full minutes, then archived it. And I never replied. Instead, I leaned harder into my work. After graduation, I didn't move home. I didn't even visit. I took a train down the coast and rented a basement apartment in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood. It was tiny, the paint peeled in the corners, and the plumbing screamed whenever the neighbor flushed upstairs. But it was mine. I bought a second-hand drafting table, stuck sticky notes all over the walls, and worked until 2 or 3 in the morning most nights. My first real client was a midwife collective looking for branding that felt sacred, not sterile. I gave them soft curves, warm color palettes, and a logo that still gives me chills to this day. They paid me half my rate, but referred me to everyone they knew. Slowly, my portfolio grew. Word of mouth turned into inquiries. Inquiries turned into contracts. Eventually, I hired an assistant, Tara, who was barely out of college herself, but smart as hell. We were building something. It didn't look like Mercer and Son, but it didn't have to. During this time, I watched from afar as my family became a polished, curated brand of its own. My brother's wedding was a gala-level affair, rented vineyards, flower arches taller than most trees, a string quartet flown in from New York. I was invited, technically, but only after someone from the event planning firm called to ask for my meal preference. No personal phone call, no letter. I declined, citing a schedule conflict, though the only conflict I had was with my own pride. I sent a watercolor painting as a gift, a vineyard landscape with their initials hidden in the vines. I never got a thank you. A few months later, I saw photos from the wedding on social media. Grant and Elaine looked like a magazine couple, perfect smiles, champagne flutes poised mid-toast. In one shot, my father beamed at them with the kind of pride I had only ever imagined. The caption read, "The future of the Mercer name." It felt like another erasure, but this time, I didn't flinch. The worst betrayal wasn't being ignored. It was being rewritten. Over the years, they constructed a story where I simply didn't exist. Or worse, where I was a minor character who drifted off early, too fragile or disinterested to stay involved. That narrative circulated in extended family circles and among old family friends. I'd hear from distant cousins, "We heard you moved out west, doing some kind of art thing?" Or, "Your dad said you like to keep things low-key." They made it sound like I had vanished by choice. And in a way, maybe I had. But what they didn't realize was that my absence was my resistance. I wasn't disappearing. I was disentangling. That distinction became painfully clear the year my mother died. I got the call at 6:15 a.m. from Grant, who sounded irritated more than grief-stricken. "Mom collapsed last night," he said. "It was a stroke or something. She's gone. I thought you should know." That was it. No offer to fly me in. No mention of arrangements. Just a cold, perfunctory call like he was checking off a box. I flew to Phoenix on my own dime and booked a motel room near the chapel. I wore navy blue instead of black, just to be difficult. At the service, I sat 2 pews behind the front row, alone, surrounded by whispered judgments and sidelong glances. No one acknowledged me, not even my father. Grant's speech was all about family, tradition, legacy. He told a story about Mom teaching him to tie his shoes, and another about how she always knew he'd be great. I waited for my name. It never came. After the service, I approached my father near the refreshment table. He looked thinner than I remembered, more fragile. But when I said, "I'm sorry for your loss," he just nodded, took a sip of lukewarm coffee, and turned away. That night, in my motel room, I lay awake staring at the popcorn ceiling, replaying every moment of the funeral. That was the last time I saw my mother. The last time I saw my father alive. I could have pushed harder, could have demanded recognition, could have made a scene. But I didn't. I simply stood there and watched the door close, knowing that when the estate came to pass, I'd be written out of it. What I didn't know yet was how much freedom came with that erasure. There's something profound about losing everything you thought you needed from people who never truly saw you. It breaks something, yes, but it also unburdens. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring on my birthday. I stopped trying to make my father proud. I stopped pretending that if I just succeeded hard enough, they'd finally include me. That kind of hope is a parasite. It feeds on your spirit, drains your joy. When I let it die, something else bloomed in its place. Purpose. Not revenge, not bitterness, though I'd be lying if I said I never felt those things, but purpose. I poured it into my work. Tara and I expanded the studio, took on 2 more part-timers, launched a mentorship program for young designers from underserved communities. We hosted workshops, gave talks, built networks. Clients started calling us visionaries. One even said, "You're building more than a brand. You're building a movement." And that's when I realized this was my inheritance. Not the lake house, not the stocks, not the gleaming Mercer name etched on a law office door. My inheritance was the refusal to be forgotten. Every design we delivered, every mentee we uplifted, every nonprofit we helped amplify, it was all a part of that. And I was only getting started. Grant and Elaine could keep their money. I had something they never even thought to want, a name that meant something because I gave it meaning. Not because it was passed down, but because I built it up from scratch with my own hands. They might have left me out of the will, but what they didn't realize is I was already leaving them behind. 2 years after the funeral, something unexpected happened. A journalist reached out to me. At first, I thought it was spam. The email subject line read, "Seeking interview. Women shaping Seattle's creative future." But when I opened it, I realized it wasn't a scam. It was a legitimate inquiry from a writer for a regional magazine that focused on business innovation and social equity. She said she'd been following my studio's work for months and wanted to feature me in an upcoming issue. I blinked at the screen, rereading her words 3 times before it sank in. I wasn't used to people noticing me for what I built. Not like this. Not because of who my family was or wasn't. I was being seen, finally, publicly, for the very thing they had always dismissed, my own voice. We did the interview over oat milk lattes at a sun-drenched cafe on Capitol Hill. I wore a blazer I'd thrifted from a boutique that only carried pieces made by women designers. The journalist, Alina, was sharp and curious and didn't shy away from asking about the deeper layers of what I was doing. She asked about my upbringing, my motivation, what pushed me to start the mentorship program. I hesitated for a moment before answering, not wanting to turn it into a therapy session. But eventually I said it plainly. I spent my life trying to be seen by the wrong people. Now I build places where people like Me don't have to beg for a seat at the table. Her eyes lit up. That quote ended up as the pull quote in the article. When the piece went live, it caught fire in a way I never could have predicted. Within a week, I'd received 4 new client inquiries, 2 podcast invitations, and a request to speak at a local women's leadership conference. Tara cried when she read the article, not out of surprise, but because she'd watched me struggle through every self-doubt, every night I'd considered quitting, every time I paced the studio floor wondering if any of it was working. We toasted with grocery store champagne that night, sitting cross-legged on the studio floor surrounded by scraps of mock-ups and mood boards. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I wasn't performing for someone else's rubric. I wasn't living in the shadow of a last name I was supposed to revere. I was making something new, something with its own spine. And that's when the letter came. It was thick, embossed with gold trim, and addressed to Ms. Vanessa Mercer in flawless cursive. At first, I thought it was another speaking invitation, some gala or nonprofit dinner. But the return address stopped me cold. It was from the estate attorneys who had handled my father's will. I stared at it for 10 full minutes before opening it. Inside was a formal notice stating that a previously undisclosed addendum had surfaced during an audit of archived records. The letter said I was entitled to a personal effects package, a sealed box that had been locked in a storage unit my father had paid for years before his death. There was no mention of what was inside, only that the contents were to be delivered directly to me. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wondered if it was a sick joke, a final puzzle piece in a lifelong game I'd never been invited to play. But curiosity outweighed dread. I called the number listed, verified my identity, and within 2 days a courier arrived with a nondescript gray box sealed with a tamper-proof sticker. I waited until Tara left for the day before opening it. Inside, I found 3 things: a weathered leather journal, a small velvet pouch tied with a satin ribbon, and a manila envelope labeled in my father's handwriting, Dash for Ness, if she still cares to know. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't heard that nickname, Ness, since I was a teenager. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp and slanted, but slightly trembled, likely from his illness. The letter was brief. Ness, if this has found its way to you, then I'm already gone. I won't pretend I was the kind of father you needed. I can't fix that. But I can give you this, a truth I never spoke because I didn't know how to. You were never less. You were different, and I didn't know what to do with that. The journal was your mother's. She left it for you, said you'd understand her better through it. As for the pouch, it's yours. You'll know what to do with it. I hope someday you'll build something better than I ever did. I believe you already have. Dad. I didn't cry. Not at first. I read the letter 3 times, then set it aside and picked up the pouch. Inside was a pendant I'd seen only once before, when I was maybe 6 or 7. A heart-shaped locket that my mother used to wear, etched with tiny stars. I remember sitting in her lap one Christmas and tracing those stars with my finger while she hummed softly to herself. After she died, I assumed it had been buried with her or lost in the shuffle of her jewelry box. But here it was, warm from the pouch, delicate, familiar. I opened the journal next, bracing myself. The first page was written in my mother's gentle script. To my Nessie, in case I'm not there to say all this out loud. My heart clenched. Page after page, she'd written about her early years with my father, about how hard it had been to raise a daughter in a house that worshipped stoicism. She wrote about how she'd watched me disappear into myself and how she hated that she didn't know how to stop it. She described my drawings, my laughter, the way I used to hum to myself when I thought no one was listening. She remembered things I had long forgotten, like how I used to insist on being called artist instead of kid, or how I once sold drawings to neighbors for quarters at our 4th of July block party. One line stood out above all others. "You were my heartbeat in a house full of noise." That's when I cried. I pressed the journal to my chest and wept for everything I never got to say, for all the times I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the moments of connection with her, for all the years I assumed she had chosen silence over me. But she hadn't. She'd just been trapped too. Trapped in a family that taught her to serve rather than speak. Her words didn't undo the hurt, but they softened it. They gave me something solid to carry forward. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about legacy. Not the kind etched on plaques or passed down in real estate portfolios, but the quiet kind. The kind that lives in journals and whispered lullabies and tucked away pendants. I started writing my own entries, not for myself, but for the young women I mentored, for the daughters they might one day raise. I began recording my journey, the truth of it, not the glossy version. The late nights, the panic attacks, the tiny wins that no one applauds. I wanted them to know what was possible and what it cost. I also expanded the studio's mission. We added a storytelling branch, a project dedicated to archiving the personal histories of underrepresented women entrepreneurs. We interviewed immigrants, survivors, single mothers who'd started catering businesses from kitchen tables, teenagers who coded apps after school to help pay bills. Their stories weren't front-page material, but they were extraordinary, and they deserved to be told. One of them, a woman named Kemi who built a fashion label out of discarded fabric scraps, told me something I'll never forget. "When you don't inherit power, you make it." That line became our studio's motto. I had it painted in sweeping brushstrokes across the wall. And then, just as things were flourishing, just as I was beginning to feel like I'd found a home inside myself, Grant called. I hadn't heard his voice in over a year. His number popped up on my screen during a staff meeting, and I stared at it for a full minute before stepping into the hallway. I picked up, said nothing. He sighed on the other end. "Vanessa, hey. I need to talk to you. It's about Dad. And the business." There was hesitation in his voice. Not entitlement, not confidence, but something frayed. Something uncertain. My stomach tightened. I hadn't been part of his world in years. "Why now?" He continued. "I know things between us are complicated, but I think you need to hear this. Can we meet?" My mouth was dry. I looked through the glass wall at Tara, still scribbling notes on a whiteboard, and then at the photos of our clients hanging above the studio door. I thought about the journal, the locket, the letter that had changed everything. And I said, maybe. Just one word. But it wasn't a surrender. It was a calculation. Because if Grant was reaching out now, it meant something had changed. And I wasn't walking into it as the forgotten daughter this time. I was walking in as the woman who had built something no one could take away. Not even him. I agreed to meet Grant 2 days later, mostly out of curiosity. We chose a neutral spot, a quiet, low-lit cafe tucked into a converted brick warehouse in Pioneer Square. It was the kind of place with reclaimed wood tables and ceramic mugs that looked hand-spun. The kind of place where secrets could sit between sips of coffee without shattering. I arrived first and chose a corner booth, facing the door. I wanted the advantage of visibility, of control. When he walked in, I noticed the changes right away. The gray streaks threading his temples, the way his shoulders slumped just slightly. He looked older, more brittle, maybe even unsure of himself. It was strange to see him like that. He spotted me and offered a small wave, the kind that said he wasn't sure I'd still be there. I didn't wave back. "Vanessa, he said as he slid into the booth across from me. Thank you for agreeing to this. I wasn't sure you'd come. I took a measured sip of my tea and said nothing. Let the silence do the heavy lifting. He gave a tight, awkward smile, then ran his hands over his face. Okay, he exhaled. I won't pretend this isn't weird. It is. It's weird as hell. But I need your help. That was new. I raised an eyebrow. Help? I asked, not bothering to mask the incredulity in my voice. From the sister, who doesn't exist? The one left out of the will, out of the company, out of every Mercer family photo for the last decade. My words landed like stones. His face tightened, but he nodded.
Yeah.
That's sister. He explained that after our father's death, things began unraveling faster than he could keep up. The company had been riding on legacy and debt, not as stable as he was led to believe. Turns out, Walter Mercer had made risky investments in his final years, hoping to grow the company's value before handing it off. When the market shifted, those investments cratered. The properties were over-leveraged, and creditors were circling like vultures. We're bleeding, Grant said, his voice lower now, more ashamed than I'd ever heard. And I don't know how to fix it. I sat still, letting that reality settle between us. I could see it, the desperation etched behind his carefully practiced calm. So, what does this have to do with me? I asked. He looked down, fiddling with a sugar packet. Your name still carries weight, he said quietly. Not with investors, with the public. Your studio, the work you're doing, people respect you. And they know you're Mercer. If you were willing to, I don't know, align with us publicly, vouch for the firm's integrity, maybe help us rebuild the brand image. I actually laughed, sharp and bitter. You want me to put my name on the same banner that wrote me off like I was dead weight? I could feel my hands trembling under the table, so I curled them into fists in my lap. Tell me something, Grant. What exactly would I get in return for selling my credibility to save your legacy? He hesitated, then looked me square in the eyes. A stake.
Full partnership.
40% ownership. The air went still around us. I blinked, not because I was tempted, but because it stunned me that he thought that would be enough. That the same brother who let me be written out of our family like a footnote now thought equity could erase a lifetime of exclusion. You know, I said slowly, I used to dream about being asked to be part of that firm. About seeing my name on the letterhead. Mercer and daughter. My voice cracked, just slightly. But you all made it very clear there was no room for me. Not then. Not when Mom died. Not even when Dad did. And now, when everything's burning down, I'm suddenly valuable? I shook my head. I didn't build my name, so you could use it as a life raft. Grant looked defeated. For the first time in our adult lives, he didn't look like the golden sun. He looked like a man who had coasted so long on someone else's script that he had no idea what to do when the ending changed. It wasn't all my idea, he mumbled. Dad made the choices. Elaine had opinions. I cut him off. You just went along with it. Because it worked for you. I could feel the heat rise in my chest, the memories flooding back, the ignored calls, the smirks, the whispered judgments. You didn't fight for me when it mattered. And now you're asking me to save you. He didn't argue. He just sat there, staring into his untouched coffee, silent. That silence told me more than any apology could. He knew I was right, and he knew he had no right to ask. I stood up, gathering my coat. I'm not your lifeline, Grant. I never was. And I'm done pretending I ever wanted to be. As I turned to leave, I paused. You want to fix the company?
Try honesty. Try humility.
But don't ask me to clean up a mess I wasn't allowed to be part of building. I walked out of that cafe with my spine straighter than it had been in years. Outside, the winter sun had broken through the clouds, casting long golden stripes across the sidewalk. I felt it on my face like an anointing. Not vindication, something quieter. Clarity. For most of my life, I had bent myself into contortions for approval that was never going to come. But standing there in my own city on my own terms, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I had built something more lasting than legacy. I had built meaning. The weeks after our meeting were strangely calm. I thought maybe Grant would call again, try to renegotiate, plead. But he didn't. Instead, I received a formal letter from the firm's legal counsel confirming that the offer had been withdrawn.
No epalegi.
Just closure. And I welcomed it. I focused on the studio. We signed 2 new contracts with community organizations, expanded our mentorship program to include girls from local high schools, and launched a scholarship fund in my mother's name. I called it Heartbeat. It felt right. She had loved me quietly, but she had loved me nonetheless. One afternoon, while reviewing mock-ups for a women's health campaign, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a thin stack of old photographs and a single page in my father's handwriting. The photos were of me, as a child, painting in the backyard, asleep in a hammock, holding a third-place science fair trophy with a shy smile. Photos I'd never seen before. The note read, "I kept these. I looked at them often. I just never knew how to tell you." It didn't absolve him, but it did something else. It softened the edges. Made the man seem less like a villain and more like a ghost trying to make peace with his own failings. I placed the photos in a shadow box, not to honor him, but to remind myself of the complexity of love, of how absence and presence can exist in the same breath. My father had failed me, yes, but not entirely, not absolutely. And perhaps in the end he knew it too. That mattered. A few days later, I stood in front of a packed audience at the local college, delivering a talk titled "Legacy is not a lineage, it's a choice." I told them about the boxes we inherit and the ones we break open. I spoke about the power of building something from the ashes of being dismissed. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. I scanned the crowd and saw faces that reminded me of who I used to be, women with questions in their eyes and fire in their bellies. One young woman approached me afterward, tears brimming. "Thank you," she said, "for showing us that you don't have to be included to matter." And I realized she wasn't just thanking me. She was reminding me of everything I had become, of the legacy I was still writing, on my own terms, with no permission but my own. 3 months passed before I heard from Grant again. I'd almost convinced myself he wouldn't reach out, that he'd learned, finally, to let the silence between us hold its weight. But one gray afternoon, as the cherry blossoms along Yesler began to blush into bloom, I opened my inbox to find an email with the subject line, "Elaine has left." It was just 6 words.
Vanessa, I'm sorry.
I didn't know.
No pontuation, no contexto, no preâmbulo.
I stared at the screen, letting the words filter through the invisible static of disbelief.
It didn't make sense.
He wasn't the kind to reach out twice unless something had broken past the point of repair. I didn't respond right away. I forwarded the message to a private folder, closed my laptop, and walked out of the studio into the cold spring air, needing space to think without the echo of his voice in my head. But the next morning I got the full story, not from him but from a news alert. Mercer and Son COO resigns amid misappropriation allegations. Elaine, the carefully coiffed wife who'd once stood beside Grant like a queen at a coronation, had abruptly stepped down. The article hinted at an internal audit, misused company funds, and a string of anonymous whistleblower tips that had reached the board. My stomach sank, not from sympathy, but from the sharp, familiar sting of knowing exactly how betrayal metastasizes inside a legacy built on silence. In that moment, I didn't see her as my sister-in-law. I saw her as another extension of the house that never let me in, and now, finally, was caving in from the rot beneath the paint. By the end of the week, I found myself once again seated across from Grant, this time at a bench in Volunteer Park, the thin spring light filtering through still bare trees. He looked 10 years older than the last time. Eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Tai Askew," a man suddenly forced to look down from a crumbling pedestal. "She siphoned money from the foundation," he said quietly, almost as if he were confessing to the breeze. "Set up dummy vendors, fake invoices, the whole thing. I didn't see it. I didn't want to." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Dad always said I'd need someone to watch the books. I just thought he didn't finish. I didn't prompt him." The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, saturated with every choice we'd both made. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Because when the floor falls out beneath you, sometimes the only person who understands the gravity is the one who's already been dropped. Grant let out a slow breath. "Because I don't know who I am without all of it. Without her, without the company looking like it has it together. And I don't think I ever did." It was the most honest thing I'd heard him say in my entire life. I turned my head and studied his profile. The same jawline as our father, but softer now, less sure. I remembered being 12 and watching him play varsity basketball, convinced he was a god. And here he was, all too human. "I built something that matters, Grant," I said, not out of spite, but out of truth. "I built it without being given a cent, without my name on a building. And it wasn't easy, but it was real. You want to know who you are without Mercer and Son? Try building something where no one hands you a script." He nodded, slowly. "I think I want to," he said. "But I don't know where to start." And I didn't know what came over me then, whether it was some strange tether of shared blood or the fading memory of my mother's voice telling me to be kind even when it's hard. But I reached into my bag and handed him a worn business card. Not for pity. Not for absolution. Just a gesture. "This is the consultant I hired to help us scale when we hit capacity," I said. "She doesn't care about last names. She cares about ethics and systems. Maybe she can help you start fresh." I stood to leave. "But don't call me again unless it's for something honest." He looked up at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes since we were children: gratitude, unpolished and quiet. "Thank you," he said. And this time I believed he meant it. I didn't go home that night. I took a long walk through the arboretum instead, weaving through the winding paths, letting the quiet soothe the sharp edges of memory. I passed a mother holding her daughter's hand, whispering something that made the little girl laugh. For a fleeting moment, I felt the weight of what could have been a different family, a different inheritance. But I didn't linger there. I couldn't, because I had work to do. My kind of legacy didn't come from what was handed down. It came from what I reached for, what I chose to shape with my own hands. Back at the studio the next day, we launched a new project, The Unnamed Women. It was a digital archive for stories like mine, daughters who had been edited out of wills, overlooked in boardrooms, dismissed in rooms where they should have been celebrated. We posted the first call for submissions and were flooded within hours. One woman wrote, "My father gave the house to my brother, but I built the porch with my own hands. Thank you for giving us a space to speak." Another said, "My mother told everyone I was the sensitive one. I'm a damn doctor now. No one ever asked how I got there." Reading their stories, I felt less alone than I ever had, and more certain that I had done something they never could take. I had made my own name mean something. And then, without fanfare, something happened I never expected. A letter arrived, handwritten, postmarked from Sedona. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting was not. Inside was a single page from my aunt, my mother's sister, a woman I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. She wrote, "Cecily told me once that you had more fight in you than any Mercer combined. I watched your story unfold from afar. She would be proud, Vanessa.
So proud.
I've attached the deed to the cabin. It's yours. Your mother left it in my care because she didn't trust anyone else to understand what it was. But I think you do." At the bottom was a notarized copy of the deed to a modest two-bedroom cabin tucked in the pines of northern Arizona. I couldn't stop shaking. I'd assumed that cabin had been sold off years ago or handed quietly to Grant like everything else. But there it was, gifted to me by a woman who saw what my mother couldn't say in life, only leave in legacy. That cabin had been the only place I ever saw my mother breathe deeply. No heels, no hosting, no demands. Just firewood, quiet mornings, the two of us reading side by side. And now it was mine. Not as compensation, as acknowledgement. Proof that someone had seen me after all. I booked a flight for the following week. Alone. No itinerary, no obligations. Just me and a place where silence wasn't punishment, but peace. I brought the journal, the locket, the old photos. And when I arrived, I lit a fire in the old stone hearth, pulled the curtains open to let in the gold-threaded dusk, and whispered, "I'm here." I didn't mean it to anyone in particular, or maybe I did. Maybe to my mother, or the girl I used to be, or the legacy that didn't come in a will, but in knowing that I had chosen to matter. And as I sat down to write my first entry in a new notebook, one that would someday be passed along not as an inheritance, but as a torch, I knew the final chapter of this story wasn't about loss. It was about claiming what was never given and leaving something brighter behind. The cabin smelled of pine and ash and something softer, maybe memory. I stayed there for a week, maybe two. I lost count of the days, not because they blurred, but because they finally began to feel full. No clients, no calls, no calendar pings. Just the rhythm of my own breath and the hush of wind through branches. I woke up with the sun and read pages from my mother's journal over black coffee. I walked along the edge of the stream behind the cabin where she used to take me when I was small. I spoke out loud to her sometimes. Maybe I was speaking to myself. It didn't matter. For the first time, the silence around me didn't feel like absence. It felt like presence. Like a room made of recognition. That place, untouched by all the architecture of wealth and resentment, became the sanctuary I hadn't known I needed. It was the inheritance no one had planned for, and maybe that's why it mattered most. By the time I returned to Seattle, something in me had settled. Not moved on. I don't believe we ever really do that, but rooted, like my grief and anger and disappointment had finally found a place to live where they didn't have to be exorcised. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to my brother, not to the old boardroom ghosts, not even to the version of myself who once believed that recognition was the same thing as love. The studio thrived in my absence. Tara met me at the door with a stack of updates and the widest grin I'd ever seen. We'd landed a contract with a National Equity Foundation. A feature was set to run on us in a global design journal. And more than a dozen new submissions had come in for the Unnamed Women project. I read through each one with a reverence I didn't yet have words for. Each story, each voice, tiny revolutions. I decided to bind them into an anthology.
Not just for them.
For all of us. And then came the ceremony. It wasn't planned. It grew out of something we started calling legacy circles, small gatherings of women, often at night, sitting in our studio under strands of soft golden light, sharing stories of what we were told we couldn't have, couldn't become, couldn't say. At first, they were informal. A few chairs, some herbal tea, a few journals passed around. But then one night, a woman named Noor brought in a scarf that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman denied education, married at 14, and who used to stitch verses of poetry into the hems of curtains so her voice wouldn't vanish. Noor stood, held the scarf in both hands, and said, "She never had a will. This is the only thing I have that she left me. But I think she gave me more than anyone ever saw." It broke something open in the room. That's when we decided we would host a public ceremony, not to mourn what we weren't given, but to name what we'd created. A reclamation ritual. Not for the world, for ourselves. We held it in a repurposed greenhouse just outside the city. 70 women came. Some brought old letters, some brought handmade objects. One even brought a tree branch from a fig tree her mother had planted in their backyard before leaving for good. I brought the locket and the journal. We laid everything on a long table draped in linen, objects that had no market value but were saturated with meaning. Before the night ended, we each spoke a single sentence into the dark, claiming the legacy we chose to leave behind. Mine was simple. They erased me from the will, but I made myself unforgettable. After the ceremony, something shifted in our community. Women started bringing their daughters to studio events. Others launched businesses, nonprofits, books. We weren't just telling stories anymore. We were shaping futures. I watched all of it unfold with a quiet awe, not because I believed I'd built it alone, but because I had finally learned to stop asking for permission to be the architect of my own story. A few months later, I received one last letter from Grant. This one came in a small box wrapped in brown paper and string. Inside was a handwritten note and a photograph I hadn't seen before. It was from the summer we stayed at the cabin, probably 1996. I was 10. Grant was 13. We were sitting on the porch, barefoot and squinting into the sun, our mother beside us, a book open on her lap. The note was short. "Vanessa, I found this cleaning out the last of Dad's files. Thought you might want it. I'm leaving Phoenix. Selling the house. Starting something new, small, honest. I won't ask for anything else. But if you ever want to talk, the door's open."
Grant.
I didn't cry. I didn't rush to reply. I didn't feel the urge to forgive or forget. But I pinned the photo above my desk, right next to the map of our studio expansion plans. Not as a symbol of reconciliation, but as a reminder of the mess and beauty of becoming. Of how some stories don't need happy endings to be worth telling. And now, I'm telling it to you. Because if you've ever been left out of the story, written out of the will, the memory, the moment, I want you to know that erasure is not the end. It's the beginning. You get to decide what remains. You get to decide what's built in your name, in your voice, in your mother's memory. They took the money. They took the house. But they couldn't take the part of me that mattered most. My integrity. And I turned it into a legacy. If this story reminded you of your own, or helped you hold a piece of it a little more gently, share it.
Comment.
Let someone else know they're not alone. Thank you for listening to mine.